Hey FBN, good to see you. Hope you guys are all doing well. Excited for tonight and jumping into Proverbs chapter 6, and I look forward to this conversation with you and this discussion. Or this presentation, I guess, since we're not really actually talking to each other. But yeah, I'm excited about just this message. And so if you have a copy of the scriptures, would you grab that? Join us in Proverbs chapter 6. Also, I'll be reading a few other verses just to support what we're speaking on this evening. So if you are a note taker, you can go ahead and just have this in your mind. I'm going to be reading some verses, and you can jot those verses down later for future reference if you want. But what we're looking at tonight is kind of two principles of good stewardship. Thankfully, Proverbs takes a break here, and at the start of chapter 6, it starts talking about some financial issues, stewardship issues. Last week was pretty heavy. The last 2 weeks, actually, pretty heavy in just the world of physical attraction and lust and, the adulterous and promiscuous ways of people. And so I'm glad for a little break here. Those things were always a little more difficult to teach through. However, it was kind of interesting. I did get a few people, their feedback being, that last week was fun for them somehow. Hopefully what they mean by that is that, the discussion was good and engaging, for them because that topic is rarely fun, if you know what I mean. But I'm glad that people are letting the word just kind of soak into their lives and that they are contemplating these things at a serious level. And I pray that we would do that even this evening when it comes to stewardship. Now, if I had to bridge the gap between our conversations about promiscuity and all of that stuff to more of a financial focus here this evening, listen, it's all stewardship. Our bodies, our money, both should be tools and avenue through which we are good stewards with what God has given us. Right? So there is a very strong connection. It makes sense that Solomon would go from one to the other and then kind of back to the other, because it's all stewardship. We have been given so much. In fact, nothing we have is truly ours. It's all from God. It's all His gift to us, whether that be your body, which is perhaps one of His greatest gifts to us outside of salvation and creation, that He has given you a body to use for His glory, but He has also given us resources and various levels of wealth and prosperity and well-being and all of that stuff that He has given us, whether you feel like you have a lot or a little. My guess is most people, if you have a computer or a phone to listen to this on, you're doing all right in regards to the whole world. You're doing okay. You may not feel like it because you live in this country, but still you're doing okay if you have access to this chat here. So all that to say, stewardship is one of the main points. So it makes sense why we would be going into the conversation we're having this evening. Okay, so two principles of good stewardship. Let's have a word of prayer and we'll talk about them. God, thank you so much for this time, this evening of just Bible study. We pray that you would just use your word once again to just richly speak to our hearts and our minds. God, financial stewardship is not one that comes easy to many people. We all have our battles with it, struggles with it, God, and so many of us live freely in that area without any consciousness of any conviction, really, or any reverence and worship to you in those places. So I pray that you would bring a spiritual perspective to our physical wealth and resources so that we might be good stewards who use these things to bring you glory and to help others do the same. And so we ask that you would do that work this evening through your word. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right. Proverbs chapter 6. I'm going to start in verse 1. Okay, follow along with me. I'm reading from the CSB, whatever translation you're reading from. It's all very similar, okay? So it's the same point. Verse 1, My son, If you have put up security for your neighbor or entered into an agreement with a stranger, you have been snared by the words of your mouth, trapped by the words from your mouth. Do this, then, my son, and free yourself, for you have put yourself in your neighbor's power. Go, humble yourself, and plead with your neighbor. Don't give sleep to your eyes or slumber to your eyelids. Escape like a gazelle from a hunter, like a bird from a hunter's trap. Okay. So we're going to start with these 5 verses. We'll talk about the next 5 or 6 verses here in just a little bit. But the first principle of good stewardship would have to be based on this context. What we're talking about this evening is what we're eventually going to call generosity. Okay, it's just generosity, but through what he's talking about here, which is avoiding becoming accountable for another person's debt. Okay, so he says, my son, if you have put up security for your neighbor or entered into an agreement with a stranger, you have been snared by the words of your mouth and trapped by the words from your mouth. And then he says with urgency to free yourself, because now you're under your neighbor's power, to go humble yourself and plead with your neighbor, and to do it before you sleep. And he uses the word in verse 5 to escape, right? So in one sense, this first principle of stewardship is just to avoid debt and to avoid being accountable for other people's debt, okay? But you'll see what I mean by generosity here in a minute, why that's kind of the underlying principle, I believe. And so, scripturally, there's a lot to say about debt, going into debt. I don't know, in our world, we frequently look at a home or look at, a vehicle, and we think, well, we need that. And it's just so easy for us to take out a loan where we become indebted to a bank or indebted to even another person so that we can get the thing that we want. Right? Biblically speaking, there's kind of maybe 3 levels to this. First is just the ideal situation, right? Ideally, we would avoid debt at all times. We would work until we have the money to pay for anything outright without being in debt to anyone, right? Culturally, this is really, really hard to pull off, especially if you're, a young person just trying to make it. You don't have any money. You got to work. And, if you're doing that, then you're probably not driving the nicest car. So you're going to have to keep pouring money into cars. So I'm not saying that there's not maybe some financial, wisdom too when you might have to take out, a debt or not. I mean, you just got to submit your financial self to the Lord at all times so that he can speak into that. But ideally, we want to be free from debt, whether that be our own or whether that be someone else's, which is what he's talking about here in 6. If you have put up security for your neighbor or entered into an agreement with a stranger, you have been snared by the words of your mouth, trapped by the words from your mouth. And then to free yourself up, right? So an example of this, I remember back when I was renting my first house, and I needed a co-signer, right? Which was basically because I am young and pretty broke, the people who were going to let me live in this house and needed someone else to co-sign with me in case I could never make the payment, then that debt would fall upon my co-signer. And I remember talking to my dad about that because my dad, why wouldn't he co-sign for me? I mean, he's my dad. And he had a strong hesitation to this that I didn't understand. But I understand it now, right? Because ideally, right, I should wait to get in that house until I can support myself. You know what I mean? I understand, once again, that in this world it's kind of hard to make it without a benefactor, or kind of a co-signer on life even. But when it came to just that moment, I remember him wrestling with that. The Lord took care of it all either way, you know what I mean? And so it wasn't an issue, but I always wondered why he wrestled with that. Well, that's because biblically, you know what I mean? The ideal is that we would always be free from debt, and that we would be free from carrying other people's debts, if that makes sense, okay? But this doesn't mean that we don't have a responsibility to tend to people who are in financial crisis. And so that's kind of top tier ideal, is that we would just be free from all of those things, right? In fact, in Luke chapter 6, verses 34 through 36, part of this kind of ideal situation. Jesus says, if you lend to those from whom you expect to receive, what credit is that to you? Right? Even sinners lend to sinners to be repaid in full. But love your enemies, do what is good, and lend expecting nothing in return. Then your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High, for he is gracious to the ungrateful and evil. Be merciful, just as your Father is also merciful. Okay? And so instead of, co-signing for, somebody else or incurring their debt, the best thing to do, the ideal, still in this area of what is ideal, is that you would stay free from debt. But when it comes to your attendance to other people's debt, if you want to be gracious, to not lend them the money, but to just pay for it, to just take care of it. To lend, expecting nothing in return, right? These are the ideal situations, that you would never be free from debt, but if you desire, or that you would never be bound to any kind of debt, and if you desire to help another person, don't just incur their debt, but just lend and expect nothing in return. Does that make sense? That's the ideal, obviously. It doesn't always work out that way, but I think Scripture even gives us some middle ground. Okay, so that might be the best way, but there seems to be a consolation. All right, and in much of what we see here, he uses the word neighbor and stranger. To not do this for neighbors and strangers. Some scholars will say he's not necessarily talking about family members here. There's some duty still for family to take care of family, maybe. So in Deuteronomy chapter 23, this is what the law, right, the Old Testament has to say about it. Deuteronomy 23 verses 19 and 20 says, "Do not charge your brother interest on silver, food, or anything that can earn interest. You may charge a foreigner interest, but you must not charge your brother Israelite interest, so that the Lord your God may bless you in everything you do in the land that you are entering to possess." Right? In Leviticus chapter 25, verses 35 through 37, it says a similar thing. "If your brother becomes destitute and cannot sustain himself among you, you are to support him as an alien or temporary resident so that he can continue to live among you. Do not profit or take interest from him, but fear your God and let your brother live among you. You are not to lend him your silver with interest or sell him your food for profit." Okay? So there's kind of a few things going on. So in those passages, talking about brother, here we read about neighbors and strangers. Here in Deuteronomy and in Leviticus, now those verses we just read, the brother, he kind of calls people in, the realm of God's family, that we would take care of each other without charging interest, right? So I would say there is some permission based on the Old Testament at least, though it's not ideal, that if you need to help a brother who has hit hard times, that you could give to them without interest, and they would pay you back. Now, ideally, you would give to them and not return anything. That's what Jesus says, right? In the Old Testament, at least, there was this permission, though, where you could give, but give without interest. Don't give them your food for profit. Don't do any of that. And then if they want to pay back what is interest-free, then that seemed to be permissible in the Old Testament. So, ideally, you just steer clear, give without expecting back, and don't give yourself to any burden. The consolation, okay, so you can give some, but don't put in any interest on it, because after all, you're trying to help your brother. You know what I mean? It's really not about you, but it's about helping people. Ultimately, there is risk. Any extension of yourself that you give to another person financially, when you take on their debts, whenever you give anything, expecting anything in return, even if it's interest-free, you run the risk of binding yourself to debt that you didn't necessarily want to take on. You bind yourself to it maybe for a longer period of time than you signed on to. It adds family discord sometimes. I know of plenty of people who, they have a grandparent or a parent or somebody who decides to pay, to loan money for, their kids' college graduation, but they expect, or college career, but they expect the money to be returned, and then there's got to be a timeline usually, and so it's just usually it's just better to be free of it. You know what I mean? Because the more you kind of go into that world of giving and sharing and taking on each other's burdens, financial burdens, and that kind of stuff, the more you run the risk of actually putting a relationship in an awkward situation. You're really testing the righteousness and goodness of people to enter into that financial world with those out there, with all of the possibilities out there, and expecting people to just walk all the lines very finely and with goodness. And if we've all learned anything, money can tend to send people the other way. It's really easy to not have the interest of the other person in mind. It's really easy when it comes to money to start getting super selfish and to start thinking about self and to start thinking, well, when are they actually going to pay me back? I mean, I blessed them, didn't I? I mean, I gave them money. I'm not even charging interest. At some point, they got to start giving it back. And, it can add some tension to the relationship. So shoot for the ideal. God gives some permissions in between, I think. But always, always, always be submitting it to the Lord, right? And like I said, when it comes to generosity, the point is, certainly in Deuteronomy chapter 23, Leviticus chapter 25, the point was generosity, right? The point wasn't so much you and your money, but the point was helping a brother out. You know what I mean? You got a brother who has come on hard times. And so, this whole deal of just lending and receiving and interest and all that kind of stuff, the point behind all of it is, are you trying to help that brother out, or are you trying to make money? Right? And so if you can just embrace generosity, then I think a lot of things are probably permissible. If it comes from a generous heart to genuinely help a person without your own interest in mind, right? And to do it cheerfully with a good attitude, that's the point in the scriptures. And the New Testament lifts that up constantly, right? To be a generous giver, one that is cheerful, okay? These kinds of things, right? When it comes to finances and all that kind of stuff, I mean, it's so easy for it to start creating a hoarding heart, where it's just yours. What you have is yours, and if you get it, you better expect to get it back even more so, and it just can create this place in people's hearts. It's just, there's a word I'm trying to think of. It's stingy. There it is. That's the word, stingy. We cannot be stingy people. And there certainly has to be a way for us in humility and generosity, not stinginess, to enter in to help our brother out who is in the family of God, right? We've been called to step into this world, and we need to do that. And it's part of stewardship, because the promise from scriptures is that if we do this, that he will reward us, right? That's Luke, back to Luke chapter 6, verse 35. Love your enemies, do what is good, and lend, expecting nothing in return. Then your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High. Okay, so the first principle, stay debt-free. Don't become bound to other people's debts. Shoot for the ideal, and let generosity be the attitude, right? So that's the first principle, though it was kind of broad in the way that we talked about it. Okay. The second is this, and it starts in verse 6. He says, "Go to the ant, you slacker. Observe its ways and become wise. Without leader, administrator, or ruler, it prepares its provisions in summer, and it gathers its food during harvest. How long will you stay in bed, you slacker? When will you get up from your sleep? A little slumber, a little folding of the arms to rest, and your poverty will come like a robber, your need like a bandit." Okay. So the second principle of stewardship that we see here in chapter 6 in these verses is this principle of just working hard with your hands, staying away from laziness. Okay. So the first principle, like we said, we kind of winded it to, just this principle of generosity that comes from shooting for the ideal, staying away from debt, but having a generous heart. The second principle would be what I'm just going to call just good work, right? Good work. That is work that is done well, but also done with a good heart, right? So again, it's a matter of working well with your hands in the way that God's created you to, but to do it in a way that has a good heart, right? That looks to everything that we're doing and says, I want to do this for the glory of God, that I want to do this in a way that is excellent and good because that's what he's called me to do. Okay. Now, a few notes on these verses. First of all, in verse 6, I love how he says, go to the ant, you slacker, observe its ways and become wise, right? One of the very, very, very many examples where the Bible just points, it takes our perspective and points us to something in creation where we can see what is good and what is right and learn from that and apply it to our lives, right? And here he says, go to the ant, right? And he's saying, look at this ant, right? He doesn't have a boss. He doesn't have a leader. He doesn't have an administrator. And yet, because of its nature, it is busy, it is working, it is moving, and it is gathering, and it is preparing for a future season of hunger. You know what I mean? It's preparing for it gathers its food in harvest. It prepares its provisions in the summer, right? It's a self-starter. It's just a part of the nature of an ant. It self-starts. It knows what's coming, and so it's working for its provisions ahead of time, right? It doesn't wait until everything has gone to heck, you know what I mean? And so now it's time for it to go into motion. No, it's busy. It's always providing, and it's always ready, right? I love how the Bible calls us to look at that, right? You think about Jesus in was that Matthew chapter 6, right? Look at the birds. Look at the flowers of the field, right? And he points us to those things so that we can learn just a lesson on being free from anxiety, trusting God amidst it all, right? Birds and wild. I mean, they're subject to just the forces of nature and weather and all of that kind of stuff. You know what I mean? I can't tell you how many dead birds I find on the road because they get hit by cars and nests that fall down after a storm and all that kind of stuff. And yet they never seem to be worried. And he says, look to these things because that's what I want you to be like, right? Be like them. Have this trust in me that if you trust in me, then I can spare you of that anxiety, of that worry. And then you connect all of that to Romans chapter 1, right? Where Romans chapter 1 says that if you just look, that God's divine, invisible qualities and his nature can just be seen in creation. You know what I mean? There is something, and I don't want to ever sound too new agey because I don't buy into any of that stuff, but it has also been a part of me that has been kind of a new piece of my life, just taking morning walks and just being exposed to the sunrise and the wind and the trees and just letting that stuff have an effect and just feeling, just letting that, be the context of my prayer time with the Lord and my Bible readings and things. It's been refreshing and it's been good. It's been something that was kind of absent in my life, and the Lord has just really used it to speak. And so have your eyes open to what's around. Because in creation, God's divine qualities are seen. And don't be surprised if you have an awareness to see what's around you, that God might point to those and be like, well, look at that thing. Look at that thing. What does that teach you about me, and how can you apply that to your own life, right? So he does that here. And then he says in verse 9, how long will you stay in bed, you slacker? When will you get up from your sleep? A little slumber, a little folding of the arms to rest, and your poverty will come like a robber, your need like a bandit's. Sleep, rest until you're already behind the ball and your provisions are lacking and winter's coming and so then it's frenzy, right? And there's plenty of people who live this way. They're sleeping and then they're in frenzy, and those are the only two speeds they go at, sleeping and frenzy. God calls us to something different. He calls us to Psalm 128 verse 2 says, you will surely eat what your hands have worked for. You will be happy and it will go well for you. To just work with your hands and reap the benefits of that and let that fill you with joy. All right. I listen to these New Testament verses. Galatians chapter 6 verses 9 and 10 says, let us not get tired of doing good, for we will reap at the proper time if we don't give up. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us work for the good of all, especially for those who belong to the household of faith. Okay, Ephesians chapter 4, verses 28 Let the thief no longer steal. Instead, he is to do honest work with his own hands so that he has something to share with anyone in need. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 11 and 12. Paul encourages the believers to seek and lead a quiet life, to mind your own business, and to work with your own hands as we commanded you, so that you may behave properly in the presence of outsiders and not be dependent on anyone. Okay. This is good stuff. Galatians chapter 6, verses 9 and 10. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 28. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 11 and 12. Just a few verses that all lift up this idea of working hard with your own hands to provide for what you have, right? To provide the needs of your home, the needs of your family. But listen, in each one of those verses and in all of the verses, there is this special emphasis. And so I want to read pieces of them again. We'll see if you can kind of catch the tone. Galatians chapter 6, verse 10. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us work for the good of all, especially for those who belong to the household of faith. To work for the good of all, especially for those with the household of faith. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 28. He is to do honest work with his own hands so that he has something to share with anyone in need. 1 Thessalonians 4, 11 through 12, so that you may behave properly, right, to work with your own hands, so that you may behave properly in the presence of outsiders and not be dependent on anyone. Let me ask you a question, right? If you're a hard worker, and many of us think we are, right? We work, and we provide. What's it all about? Because in these verses, and the point of the New Testament is that it's all about how we can serve God and how we can serve God through serving others, right? To work for the good of all, to share with anyone in need, to not be dependent on anyone, and to behave properly in the presence of outsiders. Where's the focus? Now, I know plenty of people who work, and hoard, and they have this storehouse and these barns of just treasure, you know what I mean, to use biblical terminology regarding your physical wealth. You have so much, and because you have been a wonderful worker with your hands, right? But is that the point? Was it ever the point of New Testament stewardship to work, and hoard, and keep, and then die and let it go to whoever? Was that ever the point? Of course it was not. Of course it was not. The point was so that you can, in your living days, take care of other people. Certainly, yeah, in your death, you know, if you have an estate or something that you can hand down to your family, that's good. But why not, in your living days, use it for the Lord? Because that's more than likely what he's given it to you for, is to use it, to share with anyone in need, to let it go to the good of all, to behave properly in the presence of outsiders, and to not be dependent on anyone. I think even when we read those lines from 1 Thessalonians 4 about not being dependent on anyone, we think, well, you know, we think of that as like a self-sufficiency kind of thing, right? I'm not dependent on anyone, not financially, not spiritually, not anything. We can sometimes use that verse to justify self-sufficiency. The point is not about you. The point is about the people that won't have to depend, the people that you won't have to depend on financially. It's giving them freedom from you and your financial stress and debt and anxiety. It's a blessing to other people when you work with your hands and provide for yourself. That's a good thing. But the point isn't you, right? The point is doing that for people, but also to work with your hands so that you have some reserves, so that when other people are in harsh times, especially those within the realm of God's family, that you can share. Because remember, the point was generosity. The point is generosity with a good attitude, not hoarding, not storing up for yourself where moth and vermin can destroy, but to share with others in need, to bless those who are not in a position to be able to bless themselves, right? Now, I know these are, touchy waters here because, especially in our culture, and just a lot of people have very strong opinions about, government assistance and all that nonsense, just If they're not going to work, if they're not going to provide for themselves, then I'm certainly not going to help them, that kind of thing. And listen, I don't even know how to begin to help advise you on that outside of if you have a generous heart that's truly submitted to the Lord. I don't think it's that big of a deal. The ones who I find who are most opinionated about that are the ones that I find they're not generous anywhere else in their life. And it's just another justification in their minds to keep them from being generous, right? Jesus seemed to have none of that, right? He came across plenty of beggars and plenty of people who did not deserve a dime, and yet he let them walk, he let them live, he gave them peace, he restored people. Personally, I don't think it's really our question. It's not really our job to just ask people, or to know everybody's backstory. Jesus just calls us to be his hands and feet and to serve and to go, use your wisdom, use your discretion. But listen, if you're letting the Lord cultivate a generous heart in your life, and if you have a good attitude about it, I'm not particularly worried. Like I said, the ones who seem to throw the biggest fit about it are the ones who have the hardest time with generosity in the first place. So it's between you and Lord to figure out where you're at and all that. But when it comes to just yourself, the two principles of stewardship here is just kind of being beyond debt and not carrying other people's debt, but still having a generous heart. It was kind of the first one, but then the second one, the second principle that is just so good is to just work well, work good, and work with a good heart. And just to work hard, to not give in to laziness that breeds sin and it breeds, poverty. Don't give yourself to that. Speaking of, just the world of promiscuity and all that kind of stuff, I think one of the best things that a young man can do who is struggling with just kind of his sexual nature and just where he's the things he's looking at and all that kind of stuff. If a young guy's addicted to porn or something like that, I mean, you got to have time to look at that stuff. You know what I mean? One of the best things that a young man can do against that world of promiscuity is to just work with his hands, to take up a job, to take up a craft or a hobby that's fun and enriching for him, and to pour into that. We all probably remember the story of David and Bathsheba, who David, rising from his slumber like midday or later, like in the afternoon, right? And that's when he saw Bathsheba on the roof and he gave himself into that lust, and it becomes a whole catastrophe. Why was he sleeping until the nighttime? You know what I mean? Why was he rising from his slumber late in the day? That kind of laziness, it just breeds, lustfulness. There's a connection there for sure. But it also breeds a whole other world where, you become dependent on other people. You become a stress in other people's lives. You take other people's generosity. You take advantage of other people's generosity. And it just confuses and convolutes the whole deal, right? So I've said enough about it, and I don't want to get too opinionated myself on it, but I want to leave it between you and the Lord to really just figure out where you're at in this. Because, listen, you're in this country, so I know for a fact that every single person who's listening tonight needs to wrestle with this in one place or another. I've never met one person who's got it down pat, right? So if it's been a while since you have submitted your financial self to the Lord, then do that tonight. If it's been a while since you've really examined what you're giving to the Lord, what you're giving to just toys, the debts that you're finding yourself in, you need to submit those things to the Lord tonight. Invite him into your financial experience and ask him what would be best for you, and ask him to cultivate a generous heart in your life. And so on a personal level, I would go ahead and end with this. Think about some of those trappings that seem to get you bound to debt, or if you have a tendency to somehow take on other people's debts, however that might work. What are the trappings, the financial trappings that seem to get you? And how can you begin praying against those things, seeking God's wisdom about that, and even making some steps away from that because of what Proverbs chapter 6 and really the whole scriptures teach about when it comes to stewardship. right? So, yeah, much to think about, much to pray about, and I pray that you would for sure, all to the praise and glory of Jesus' name. Listen, I love you all. Let's be good stewards with what God has given us, our bodies, our money, our time, and everything else. And we want to pray that he would use us to bring glory to him through it all, and that we would help others do the same. Let's do it together, guys. I love you all. You are dismissed.